You're tuned to listener-sponsored, non-commercial free speech radio, WBAI, at 99.5 FM in New York, and WBAI.org on the web. I am Johanna Fernández, your Friday host of What's Going On. In December 2022, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino paused the development of an exhibition on the Latino civil rights movement. The exhibition was paused when conservative politicians threatened to convince Congress to defund the museum for misrepresenting Latino history and harboring Marxists. That was the logic put forth by conservative politicians about the efforts of the museum in its totality. The canceled exhibition, however, was set to feature the largely unknown history of how Latinos fought to assert their place in American society. It would have covered the 1968 walkouts of 20,000 Chicano students from their schools in East LA, efforts to integrate schools by Mexican parents immediately after World War II that predated and helped win the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, the struggle against medical discrimination launched by the Young Lords' occupation of a Bronx hospital in 1970, which brought us the Patient Bill of Rights. The exhibition was also set to cover more recent organizing by Latinos around the environment, immigration rights, and around the community recovery efforts in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017, which exposed the island's colonial relationship to the United States. Full disclosure, I was one of the curators and historians hired by the Smithsonian to develop the now canceled exhibition. The censorship and persecution of history illustrated in the cancellation of this exhibition is happening against the backdrop of attempts at distorting civil rights movement history, the erasure of and violence against LGBTQ communities, and failed attempts to shut down the 1619 Project, which centered slavery as a founding institution of the United States. We'll definitely address these broader contexts later in our conversation. But for now, to help us navigate these treacherous waters, we welcome to the show Felipe Hinojosa and Ed Morales. Historian Felipe Hinojosa previously taught at Texas A&M, where he served as professor of history, assistant provost for Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives, and director of the Carlos H. Cantu Hispanic Education and Opportunity Endowment. More recently, Professor Hinojosa was appointed Baylor University's inaugural Jackson Family Chair in Latin America. He's the author of 2 books, including the award-winning Latino Mennonites, Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture. And he's co-editor of Faith and Power, Latino Religious Politics since 1945. We also welcome Ed Morales, who's a prolific author and journalist who's written for The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian. He was staff writer at The Village Voice and columnist at Newsday. Morales is the author of several books, including Living in Spanglish, The Latin Beat, Latinx, The New Force in Politics and Culture. Those books were published in 2002, 2003, and 2018, respectively. And most recently, he's author of Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico, published in 2019. In 2009, Morales wrote and directed Whose Barrio, an award-winning documentary about the gentrification of East Harlem. Morales is also a 2022-23 Mellon Bridging the Divides Fellow at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. He's also a lecturer at Columbia's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Felipe and Ed, welcome to What's Going On.
Hi, good morning, John. It's good to be here.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'd like to start with you, Felipe. Can you situate our listening audience a bit and tell us how long you'd been working on this exhibition, what your reaction was to the news that it was being paused, and that was the language given. And did you see it coming?
Well, first of all, thank you for continuing this conversation and bringing it out, putting it out in the public. I had been working on this exhibit from its inception by invitation from you. We had been working on a project together on photographs and a photographic essay book on the Latino civil rights movement. And this just seemed a natural extension of that. And that would have been, I believe, around 2021. I do remember that all of our meetings were via Zoom. And so it was in the middle of the pandemic. We had been going about 2 years strong with a curatorial team of about 8 to 10 people. And then that team would expand when it included design folks that would come in and so forth. And my reaction to the pause, I mean, consider this 2 years of work, possibly even more. We were 65% complete at the time. The meetings were almost nonstop. Granted, we were still doing our full-time jobs, so this was in addition to what we did, in addition to our day jobs. And so it was intense, but it was beautiful work. It was incredible to sort of be putting together a draft of what doing Latino history might be, what it might look like, the complexities, the contradictions, the contentious debates that we had. All of that, I think, were a wonderful part of what was happening. I think my reaction was, it was a gut punch. It was something that I certainly did not expect. I know that exhibits at times are stopped, they're paused, or canceled, whatever it might be. But we had momentum. We were going strong. Certainly there were forces at work. The article in The Hill, which I'm sure we'll talk about, had come out earlier in 2022, criticizing the current Presente exhibit that is there at the Molina Gallery at the Museum of American History. But there was, I think, every belief amongst us that we would move ahead and that our exhibit would see the light of day. And unfortunately, that did not happen.
Just to clarify for our listening audience, Congress approved the building of the National Museum of the American Latino in 2020. This means that the project began to be built, and the expectation is for that museum to be erected in approximately 10 or 12 years from now, from this moment. And it would be a museum much like the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. All of these museums are part of the Smithsonian Project, which is the largest museum in the world. But in the meantime, while the actual building is erected, there's a gallery within the American History Museum called the Molina Family Gallery. And there's an exhibition there now, the first exhibition that launched this project of the National Museum of the American Latino. And that exhibition is titled Presente. It's an overview of Latino history, everything you need to know about Latinos. And our exhibition on Latino Youth Movements was supposed to replace Presente. But as you've heard, unless you've just tuned in, the exhibition on Latino Youth Movements was canceled after pressure from conservative politicians, which charged that the museum project in its totality was harboring Marxists, distorting history, misrepresenting Latino history, but also brainwashing Latinos to think of themselves as victims of American history. And because of that pressure, the leadership of the museum decided to, quote, pause our exhibition. And it's now been a year, and it seems that that's just polite language for the cancellation of this exhibition. Ed, can you give your assessment of the significance of this development for a museum that calls itself the National Museum of the American Latino, that's not yet built? What message does this send, and what's the danger?
Well, it's a message being sent by a marginal group of ideologues that, would probably be happy with the narrative that slavery was beneficial for African Americans because it taught them skills. It's not a point of view that represents a significant portion of Latinos. I mean, even some of the history of conservative Latinos shows that Latinos in the Republican Party, also had grievances about the way Latinos were treated in the United States. Earlier versions of the Republican Party spoke to those grievances. So, it's part of this more current politics in which the extreme right has usurped the way that the left presents grievances and displaces them with their own false narrative of grievances. According to these people, I think a good exhibition, that would be in a museum that people like Alfonso Aguilar and Mike Gonzalez would support would show how Alberto Gonzalez, former Supreme Court Justice, rewrote the laws on torture, which allowed, the U.S. military to torture people at Abu Ghraib with a photo gallery of people being tortured at Abu Ghraib.
Can you repeat that for our listening audience? It's been quite a while since the Iraq War that happened immediately after September 11th. And can you identify the people you refer to?
Well, Alberto Gonzalez, was the Supreme Court justice in the Bush administration. And he and I think it was John Yee put together a position paper, a legal article that justified the use of torture under circumstances of national security. Which is, the legacy of the laws that were passed after 9/11 that, fused the Department of Homeland Security with the Constitution and allowed for, the use of torture to extract information for prisoners at places like Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And so what I'm saying is that the legal justification for that torture was, in part devised by Alberto Gonzalez, who, according to these people, would be an example of a Latino success story. And so I think that, being truthful about history, one of the exhibits under a museum, that'd be supported by this coalition of far-right Republicans should include the importance of Alberto Gonzalez's decision and, a representation of that torture through the use of photos or maybe even the paintings that the Colombian painter Botero made. He recently passed away. That would be fitting.
I'm trying to remember the term for the torture technique used in Iraq at Abu Ghraib, and that was the drowning. as a means.
Yeah, the waterboarding.
The waterboarding, exactly.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to recall. You were speaking. I was
Right.
like, what type of torture? It was waterboarding, and all of this was exposed in the aftermath of the Iraq War. And that brings me to the question: who are the critics? Who were the critics of this exhibition and of the current exhibition at the Molina Gallery? Do you want to talk to us about that, Felipe?
Well, I think the article that came out in The Hill, and I'm referencing this piece, and I'm trying to remember exactly what date, Johanna, if you have it. It's maybe in September or August of 2022, where the folks that Ed has just mentioned, Gonzalez, Aguilar, and others that were criticizing the Presente exhibit. This is, aside from identifying specific characters, this is a well-coordinated national movement that is targeting school districts, it's targeting universities, it's coming after everyone. And, you see what the consequences of this have been in Florida in terms of the canceling and the censorship in terms of what can be taught there, in terms of African American history, and in Texas. And obviously this has a longer history, the banning of ethnic studies in Arizona in the early 2000s, and the coordinated efforts that are happening across the country to essentially limit academic freedom and limit what it is that our students are learning. And it's no coincidence that this is happening at a moment when the demographics of the country are changing. They've been changing for a long time. And at the very root is an idea of folks wanting to control the narrative at every angle. The kind of force that this came with in late 22, when we were told that our exhibit was going to be paused or canceled, little did I know that my own university would be suffering and going through this sort of censorship in the following year, in early 2023. Your listeners might or might not have heard of what happened at Texas A&M with our president, who resigned, and with the way in which Kathleen McElroy, journalism professor out of UT Austin, was hired, and then her contract was renegotiated to basically nothing. She ended up turning down the position, but lo and behold, all of these text messages begin to emerge between conversations with the Board of Regents and the president of the university as a way to identify this professor as quote unquote woke and not fitting the kind of faculty that Texas A&M wants. And so it's hard to sort of think about who these faces and who these names are, because this is a well-coordinated effort that I think is coming after all of us. I think something like what happened with our exhibit at the National Museum of the American Latino should concern everybody, not only Latinos and not only folks who teach history or are historians. This is of concern to all Americans.
Felipe, the article was published in The Hill on August 11th of 2022, and it's titled "The Smithsonian's Latino Exhibit is a Disgrace." And the authors are Alfonso Aguilar, Mike Gonzalez, and Joshua Trevino. It was an op-ed. But you're absolutely right. This is a well-coordinated effort on the part of conservative politicians to really dismember this country's memory of history. And the question is, what's so important about history that throughout history there are attempts to ban books, to silence educators, to control the classroom? And I'm reminded of Malcolm X's quote, and I'm going to not articulate it accurately, but he says that of all the disciplines of study, history will reward you best. I'd like to move on to, before we get back to that topic, I just want to remind our listening audience that, again, as you were saying, Felipe, all this is happening in a broader context of attacks on the teaching of history. And we, in fact, on the show previously reported that this period's earliest attacks on the teaching of history happened in 2010 when lawmakers led by then Governor Jan Brewer dismantled the Mexican American Studies program in the Tucson public schools in Arizona. And this was a district with a majority Hispanic student population. The program that was dismantled, which was called Mexican American Studies, MAS, had a 13-year track record of success, essentially reducing dropout rates of Mexican children. Most recently, we've been witness to attacks on critical race theory and Black history in particular. This summer, as I think Ed mentioned, we learned of the approval of a Florida curriculum that depicts slavery as a job skills project that enriched the lives of the enslaved. And we also know about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's Christian conservative takeover of New College in Florida, where, among other things, the use of the word gay was banned. Let's listen to a clip from last March by MSNBC's Alex Wagner on how Florida is distorting the teaching of Rosa Parks in the schools.
In an effort to get a social studies textbook approved for use in the state of Florida, at least one publisher has made significant changes to Rosa Parks' story. The New York Times compared 3 versions of the company's Rosa Parks story meant for first graders: a current lesson used now in Florida, an initial version created for the state textbook review, and a second updated version. In the current lesson on Rosa Parks, racial segregation is clearly explained. Quote, the law said African Americans had to give up their seats on the bus if a white person wanted to sit down. In a second version created for the Florida textbook review, race is mentioned indirectly. Quote, she was told to move to a different seat because of the color of her skin. And the reference to white people is gone. And in the third, updated version, race isn't mentioned at all. Quote, she was told to move to a different seat. She did not. Who knows why Rosa Parks was told to move? Could have been anything.
And most recently, Florida's Department of Education has approved right-wing educational materials for use in kindergarten through 12th grade. These materials are from the website of an outfit that calls itself Prager University Foundation, also known as PragerU. And this is a nonprofit advocacy group and media organization that creates content promoting conservative viewpoints on a range of political, economic, and social matters. The name of the nonprofit is misleading. While it dons the title of university, PragerU is not an academic institution and does not confer degrees. Once again, here's MSNBC's Alex Wagner.
What I'm about to show you here is a sampling of the supplemental educational materials that were just approved by Florida's Department of Education for showing in public schools, kindergarten through 12th grade.
America is more than just a place on a map. It's an ideal and a set of values stemming from Judeo-Christian principles.
Despite what some confused people think, masculinity is not toxic.
Most gender stereotypes exist because they reflect the way that men and women are naturally different.
Eventually, all socialist countries face serious scarcity of basic needs.
Change, however, came to India when the British Empire took control. Along with advancements in transportation, agriculture, and government, the British spread the influence of Christianity and Western values throughout India.
Yes, the famously benevolent English occupation of India. These videos are part of a program called PragerU Kids. It is overtly right-wing, and it answers a question that I have had for a while. Ever since Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the state's so-called Stop Woke Act, which restricted teaching anything too woke in Florida schools, I have wondered what that will actually mean for lesson plans and class time. Well, last week we got our first glimpse of that with Florida's new history standards that require students to be taught that Black Americans benefited from slavery. And now we have another glimpse, PragerU Kids. The right-wing nonprofit, Prager University, which is, by the way, not an actual accredited academic institution, it describes its mission as fighting back against the left-wing propaganda pushed on children in schools. And that translates to kids magazines that teach about American heroes like Charles Schwab, J.P. Morgan, and Ayn Rand, or ones that push clean coal and describe climate change as an unproven and debated theory. It also means videos about why your kid should back the blue and reject Black Lives Matter. And it also has crafting lessons like building a model version of Israel's Iron Dome, a classic children's activity right up there with Cat's Cradle. There is also lots and lots of overtly religious, quote, Judeo-Christian content. All of that is now approved for any Florida teacher who wants to use it as supplemental content in his or her classroom from kindergarten through 12th grade. According to PragerU's website, more states are coming soon. And ladies, if that upsets you, maybe take a note from PragerU's kids video on how to be feminine and, quote, just try smiling. Just try.
And that was MSNBC's Alex Wagner. I just want to get your responses on this. Let's start with Ed. Why is history so contested? And what does this tell us about this moment in American history? It's not a transitory moment. There has been a battle, a contest over history now in this latter period since about 2010. Ed.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, in a sense, like this battle over history goes back a little further, but certainly there's a specific language that conservative right wing has been using to delegitimize, real grievances that marginalized people hold, and the idea that people are brainwashed to believe they're victims is part of the tools, because really people came to understand that they were victims in a cognitive process that moved them to the streets and to protest and to elect people who represented their interests. So the idea is to make these grievances sound like they're hysterical and ahistorical through the use of the word woke, which is a signal that grievances that have been long established by people of color and other marginalized people in the United States is illegitimate. So now this has become part of a process to, delegitimize the progress that's been made, to roll back the progress that's been made. And it's part of a project, of really a right-wing movement that's international and is repressing working class people and marginalized people. This is made more complicated by the fact that large corporations are, embracing the recognition of these grievances as a tool to recruit consumers. And so this makes it a little easier in some senses for the radical right to demonize what they call wokeness. So it's really a process of creating scapegoats and marginalizing deviance that's really similar to the emergence of fascism and earlier in the 20th century, and part of the different kind of manifestation of fascism that we're experiencing now.
Yes, you mentioned earlier that this moment really didn't begin in 2010. There's a long history in this country of banning books and silencing dissent or critiques of American society. I too was thinking about the early 20th century movement called the fundamentalist movement. That's the name it took on itself, which was a response to the theory of evolution and the ways in which science was influencing discourse in the church here in the United States. And there have been waves and waves of this kind of repression that usually follows social movements. And we know that in 2006, there have been, and most recently during the pandemic, there were massive uprisings of people. I'm talking about specifically the 2005-2006 uprisings by Latinos across the country around immigration reform. I'm wondering if either of you can speak on those and recall the magnitude of those movements that really showed that Latinos are everywhere in the United States, in the South, in places like Salt Lake City. There are photographs of demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people. Felipe or Ed, might you talk on that?
I was in Houston in 2006 when those marches took place. I marched with my family, with my parents. There were high school students that walked out of their schools. People, you're right. You're exactly right, Johanna. People marched across the country. 500,000 people marched in Dallas. Wow. Nobody really thinks of Dallas as kind of the the epicenter of these kinds of movements, and yet 500,000 folks marched in the city of Dallas, and it happened, of course, everywhere. And it's interesting to me because when I'm in the classroom and when I teach, I can see the power of history. I can see how it engages students, especially when it's an open process, when we're having a conversation, when students feel like their own personal knowledge, their upbringing, whether it be in South Texas on the border or in East Texas or in an urban area or rural, that what we've done in essence when, the kinds of history classes that I grew up taking were quite bland and boring. I mean, most of my students walk into my class and think, oh, history is my worst subject. I hate it. I'm just going to try to get a grade and get out of here, meet this requirement or whatever it may be. And what happens is something so fascinating. They leave with not only a better sense of the world, of the people around them, how struggles have shaped democracy in this country and around the world. They leave with a better understanding of themselves, and there's an internal transformation that takes place. That is what is most threatening, I think, to these folks, because there's no way you walk out of a history class and not have some sense of understanding of why people are picketing, why people are striking, why they're joining labor movements, why it is that they're raising their voice in opposition to what is happening. I think that's the power of history. That's why it remains so contentious. I'll just say one more thing, just to sort of blend those two of people's personal experiences, growing up working class, growing up experiencing discrimination and seeing it first and foremost, growing up in high school or, whatever kinds of experiences your family might have had and all that, and then bringing that personal knowledge into the classroom. when I marched in 2006, little did I know that I was going to, 3 years later, I'd be teaching history at Texas A&M. I'd be a professor there. And the students that I met, the incoming class in 2009, many of them had marched with their families. They came into Texas A&M, which is, by the way, considered to be a fairly conservative campus, a flagship university in Texas, but much more conservative history. And there was an entire generation of Latino students that entered that campus that have forever transformed that campus, by the way. Even after they've left and they've gone, they established a Latino studies minor that had never been done there on that campus. They marched to maintain in-state tuition for undocumented students, and they wanted to learn their history. These were folks that saying, we were out there marching. We want to know the history of the immigrant rights movement. We want to know what civil rights folks have done in the past so that we can learn those lessons and adjust them, move them, shake them, whatever we need to do to build movements for today. So the pushback and this kind of well-coordinated, well-funded efforts that are taking place, we have to be prepared to push back with all of our might, and not just be on the defensive, but also be on the offensive. I think also to make sure that we're doing work that is public facing, that we're engaging the public, and that we're speaking the truth and getting the stories of history out there in all their complicated messiness, not trying to sort of dilute anything for the public, but instead engage our public and have these important conversations. Because, like I said previously, these sorts of things, the cancellation of Smithsonian, this should be of concern for everybody.
You're listening to the voices of Professor Felipe Hinojosa, co-curator of the now canceled exhibition on Latino Youth Movements at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino, and Ed Morales, an author, prolific author and journalist. He's the Mellon Bridging Divides Fellow at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and he teaches Latino Studies at Columbia University. And we're talking about the censorship of history by conservative forces across the country. We'll be taking calls. The number to call is 212-209-2877. Once again, the number to call is 212-209-2877. And you're listening to WBAI at 99.5 FM in New York and WBAI.org on the web. I am Johanna Fernández, your Friday host of What's Going On. While we wait for callers, Ed, can you talk a little bit about your book on Latinos and what you discovered writing your book, and what the demographic transformation that Latino migration has produced in the last 50 years means for American society?
Okay, yeah, sure. First of all, I just want to, for the record, correct that my Mellon Fellowship term just ended on September 15th, and there's a new cohort at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and I wish them a lot of luck. It was a great experience for me, and I can talk about that some other time. But my book, is really was a book, Latinx: The New Force in Politics, American Politics and Cultures. Is really a book that tries to talk about how identifying with racial difference is the key to political power in the United States, and Latinos sort of give up their power as a group, by identifying with whiteness. The demographic changes in the United States have, it's increased the Latino population in the United States, but it's not necessarily equivalent to a strong political movement, because neoliberalism has had this effect on migrants that drive them to entrepreneurialism, and they're no longer getting jobs that would allow them to eventually join labor unions, and it has deteriorated Latino political power. The other thing I would say, though, too, is that I have an article that's coming out in the Chicanx Latinx Law Review that is about the word Latinx, which I describe how there was a coordinated Republican attack on that word. I know that it's very unpopular, but I think it's an example of how this kind of thinking can quickly persuade even moderate thinkers to reject the term. The Sarah Huckabee Sanders issued a ban on the word in early 2023. This was also preceded by LULAC, which is a moderate group that has somewhat Republican tendencies. The word, it was strongly attacked as being woke. It was attacked as a word that was created by white elites, which I demonstrate in the article is not true because it has roots in a long argument in Chicano studies and Chicanx studies, particularly led by women. And also the idea that since it violated the proper use of Spanish, that it was somehow offensive to Latinos in the U.S., when in reality our culture is one that's bilingual and features a lot of invention of words that look and sound differently. So, I was on a debate on NPR with a conservative writer who was constantly using the word woke when talking about this word. And, even though I don't really, it's not like I'm here to defend the use of this word, but I have noticed that many of the elements that are coming up in the attack on critical race theory and, in this subject, have in common the people who were sent out in National Review magazine and op-eds in the Wall Street Journal to attack this word. Yeah.
Ed, we have quite a number of callers all of a sudden.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
so let's see if we can hear from them. Caller, you're on the line. Tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Yes, good morning. It's Chris from Fairfield. How are you, Johanna and Felipe and Jose?
Good. Thank you so very much, Philip.
I'm Chris from Fairfield, actually.
Sorry, Chris.
I've been accused of being, which is not the case. I've been accused of being racist for asking this question about the semi-related topic. Has a conversation been had, or is a conversation being had by the leaders of states like California and New York and the District of Columbia with the governors of Florida and Texas as to what the heck they're doing by passing off these migrants to the other states, to the other states? Shouldn't each state that you come into be the one that processes you, whether you came in legally or not? Shouldn't that be your gateway state that processes you instead of just passing you off to another state that you don't agree with?
And that is a very legitimate question. We're going to take others, and maybe we need to have a show on the subject itself. Caller, you're on the line. Tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Hey, it's Russ in White Plains. I think the complaint that the man just made about NPR and someone having a grievance with the term woke, it recognizes that grievances are okay as long as they're your grievances. When someone else has a grievance, it's not okay. But my question is specifically, what about the banned book with Huck Finn and Mark Twain with the use of the N-word? Do you think that was good, banning that book, and that wasn't the right wing doing that?
Thank you, caller. Caller, you're on the line. Tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Yes, my name is George. I'm in Manhattan. One of your guests mentioned that Alberto Gonzalez was a Supreme Court justice. That is not true. He was the Attorney General under the Bush administration. There's a very big difference.
Any final comments?
Hey, I just want to say that the caller was right, that Alberto Gonzalez was an attorney general. It's a little early in the morning for me, and I just remember that Bush nominated him for the Supreme Court, and that didn't work out well. But it doesn't really change what Alberto Gonzalez did in history.
Absolutely. Felipe, final comments?
No, I mean, I think that the cancellation of this exhibit, I think, speaks to, again, the contentious fights over history and how we tell this American story. I'm so glad you put this on the radio show to have this conversation. I hope we have more of these conversations, and just wishing strength and love and power to all the history teachers out there, all the people that are involved in telling our story and narrating our story and writing it. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, and it's an honor for me to be a part of this fight with you all.
Thank you both for joining us. You've been listening to the voices of Felipe Hinojosa, co-curator of the now canceled exhibition on Latino Youth Movements at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino, and Ed Morales, a prolific author and journalist. He's the 2022-2023 Mellon Bridging the Divides Fellow at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and teaches Latino Studies at Columbia University. And we've been talking about the censorship of history by conservative forces across the country. Thank you so very much both for joining us.
Thank you.
Ed, we'll definitely come back to your experience as a Mellon Bridging Divides Fellow. You've been listening to non-commercial, listener-funded community radio, WBAI, at 99.5 FM in New York and WBAI.org on the web. We're rebuilding the world together and ushering in a new day. In commemoration of El Grito de Lares, Puerto Rico's first major revolt against Spanish rule on September 23rd, 1868, we leave you with Despierta Boricua by El Jíbaro, Andrés Jiménez. I'm your host, Johanna Fernández. See you next Friday.
Oye, Boricua, yo te canto esta canción. Viva la patria, viva la revolución. Oye, Boricua, yo te canto esta canción. Viva la patria, viva la revolución.
Montaña, montaña mía tan altiva y tan tallada, y en la potente mirada, y mirada que tronchó la tiranía, en su limpidez un día, hay un día cruzó el alba un lucero, que trazó su derrotero en la sangre que arremete, sobre el filo del machete, ay del machete que asoma Manolo el leñero.